And I gotta wait for him to fucking finish. And that's why I get irritated half the time. Cause like, damn, every time I fucking start, everybody wants. I ain't gonna even hold y'all. The Dodge HellCat is probably one of the most iconic yet misunderstood cars within the car world. There is an abundance of videos explaining why you should or should not get one, what it means to have one, and the car ownership experience. But I'm gonna go ahead and tell you now that a lot of people want a HellCat and don't even understand why. So in today's video, I really wanted to explore the halo paradox of the Dodge HellCat, what that means, and how it applies to the most iconic model in one of the most reputable but disreputable brands. So with that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown. So in case you're wondering why I call this the halo paradox, is because it's supposed to represent what people think the HellCat is and what it's supposed to be. If you don't know anything about halo cars, most manufacturers have one, and for Dodge it used to be the Dodge Viper, but that was discontinued back in 2017, obviously due to low volume sales, and the V10 that it had was just a little too potent and a little too unrealistic and was pretty much a low volume seller for most supercars. Part of the big thing about this video is it's supposed to explain the HellCat in its entirety as the everyday man supercar. So feel free to skip around. I'm going to leave those links in the description below, as well as the chapters, so that you can kind of get your own feels, because I know that I can be a little long-winded and I don't want to hold y'all, but I am gonna hold you. So I'm gonna go ahead and get into this now, and we're gonna start off with the history, and then we're gonna veer our way into a couple of other things. But the most important thing that I want you to take away from this is that this is not an indictment on the reputation of the HellCat as much as my analysis of it and what it is. The HellCat name has been associated with the Grumman F6F of the Warcraft back in the World War II days. Now, a lot of people don't know that, but the HellCat name goes as far back as aircraft. There's actually a few other car names that are named after aircraft, one of them being the Mustang as well as the Hurricane, which I had no idea. And as I was doing this, I found it really interesting, some of the stuff I was learning. The F6F was supposed to be a zero killer against Mitsubishi's A6M aircraft carrier during World War II. At that time, I found very interesting because Mitsubishi later on would develop a partnership with the Stellantis group or the Chrysler group or whatever you want to call it. The HellCat name has a very distinguished and reputable reasoning behind its name, and it's not uncommon for most car manufacturers to develop a name behind that. I thought that was pretty cool because we don't talk about World War II and its impact on the car industry, but that's besides the point. And the reason why it's called the HellCat is because it's supposed to represent a big body but quick type car, which is exactly what the HellCat is in comparison to its competitor, as the HellCat is a lot heavier than its competitors. For a lot of people, when they describe they want a particular car, specifically the HellCat, they always say,
"Hey bro, I want me a motherfucking HellCat."
But why do you want one, sir?
Why do you want one?
And it never comes up in the conversation. In terms of the HellCat, it is supposed to be the blue collar supercar as it is often referenced. Now, I do want to point this out that the HellCat is not just limited to the black community. There is a world of people, both black and non-black people, that absolutely love the HellCat and are absolute fans of Dodge. So I do want to put that out there so that nobody feels excluded. There's a lot of women, there's a lot of LGBTQ plus IA members that LGBTQ. There's a lot of LGBT. I can't even say it today. LGBTQIA, okay. There is a lot of women and LGBTQIA plus members that absolutely adore the HellCat, and some of them own them. So it's not just limited to men, it's not just limited to black men and or white men. So get that out your head.
Stop there.
The Dodge Charger in its original form was developed back in 1966 through 78, and it was a two-body coupe. And at some point, Dodge would resurrect it back in 1982 to 87. To be honest, we don't really talk about that version because nobody gives a f. At that point, it was developed by Mitsubishi. 1982 version, unlike the 1966 version, was a front-wheel drive based platform, unlike the rear-wheel drive of the 66. You always want to get the 66 through 78 version because that is the truth of them all. A lot of the HellCats that you know today come with what's called a Hemi engine, and the Hemi engine dates back as far as the early 60s. The Hemi stands for hemispherical design, and so the Hemi is a big big banging V8 that just yells and screams in your ear. And there is no other car company that makes horsepower like Dodge. Don't care what nobody says. Nobody does horsepower like Dodge. But the Charger and the Challenger are not the same thing, as the Charger is the four-door sedan and the Challenger is the coupe. The Charger resurfaced back in 2006 and the Challenger would arise back in 2008 into the 09 year. And so ever since then, the Charger and the Challenger, based on the LC and the LD platform, have been pretty much a huge hit success during the era of the resurgence of the muscle car. When Ford first kicked off back in 05, the Dodge Charger would see success later in 06, and then the Camaro would come on later on towards 09. The muscle car resurgence is where we begin to see Dodge really take off. But that's not the HellCat. Be ye not confused. The Charger and HellCat are not quite the same. All Chargers are not HellCats and all HellCats are not Chargers. So be not confused about the fact that if somebody looks at you like poo-poo, like you ain't got no HellCat, that's because you don't. The HellCat would resurgence back in 2015. As of this recording, there are 12 models that currently contain Hemi style engines, and so there are only a handful of HellCats that exist. So let's go ahead and move on, because the HellCat history is fine. We don't give a about that. But it's what the HellCat represents. In doing this, I realized that the HellCat represents the fast life. For all intents and purposes, the HellCat represents the fast life in the idea that the HellCat is supposed to represent everything that you embody to be quick, fast, and in a hurry. Get money, get money, get money. Now, the HellCat is fairly new considerably. It is barely 10 years old, but the conversation around HellCats as opposed to Camaro SS's and Mustang GT, because the Mustang has had a much longer lifespan than the HellCat, but the HellCat has more surroundings of clout than any other car that I am aware of. The HellCat, for all intents and purposes, the Charger, let's start there. The Charger has what's more aggressive styling. Now, a lot of that is infused with some Italian stylings from Fiat and basically their developments of their stuff overseas. But the HellCat is something that really says, don't play with me. And I did not realize that the HellCat was supposed to be a race car. It is a street legal race car. So when people say that they want one, it doesn't have the same iterations as the old box Chevys used to have. The Camaro, the Chevy Impala SS, and the Buick Regal GNX, as well as the Ford Mustangs of yore and the Crown Vics. All of those cars are all hood and country classics. Most people, when they want a HellCat, it's because of clout. So in terms of clout, someone once said that clout is a hell of a drug. I don't know who the said that, but I knew it was funny. But according to the Chicago Encyclopedia, clout actually refers to the political power and influence, which is exactly what this car does. From a perceptive perspective, the HellCat is essentially the car that everybody gets when they want their name in a conversation. The car meets that express the HellCat show nothing but that person is that guy, he is that dude, he is what everybody wants to be. Now, there are some posers out there who will essentially get a SXT or SE Charger, slap some HellCat body kits and wheels on it and call it a HellCat. No, stop that. Because you are essentially setting yourself up to be clowned and losing all disrespect. The HellCat is a $70,000 car. Now, in comparison to other supercars, the HellCat is relatively cheap by comparison, but it is called the blue collar supercar for a reason. This car contains a 6.2 liter Hemi style engine and can get upwards of anywhere between 707 horsepower and almost damn near 1,000 from a Hemi V8. It is absolutely astounding at what this car represents, but in terms of clout, the car community absolutely respects anybody that has a HellCat because it signifies that you understand what you have. You also understand that you appreciate horsepower racing, and it just puts you in the big bro category. And most guys that have this car want to be big bro. Between YouTube shorts, between TikToks, and accusations of Atlanta scammers, there is no shortage of car videos that demonstrates what the HellCat is capable of. Now, I do want to point this out. Most people that have a HellCat, while they have the clout, do not have the driving skills. The HellCat is a car that is designated for people who truly know how to drive, much like Porsche. But unlike Porsche, it lacks the same level of refinement, and that's by design. See what I did there? It's by design that it is not necessarily supposed to be a refined car. It's supposed to be wild, it's supposed to be crazy, loud, obnoxious, and all of those good things. And those sensory and visual perceptions are what creates that clout and gets you that reputation of being that dude in the car community. As a point of reference, you can get a base model SRT HellCat for about 70 bands, and it can go upwards to about 90 bands depending on what you do. And those are just starting prices before any add-ons. The crazy part is that there are people paying upwards of 100 to 120,000 just to say that they got a HellCat, and that's what I mean by clout is a hell of a drug. I'd argue though that the relatability and the association with the HellCat, especially particularly based on clout, is a little different in different communities, because obviously for black communities it means different than non-black communities, and so we'll talk about that later in the video. But hold on, give me a second, walk with me. Now, my personal favorite topic that I really explored was hip hop and its influence. So again, this video is supposed to explore things, and hip hop is a very universal thing. So we can all attest that hip hop is a part of the consumer behavior, and it's been like that for a long time, and it's probably one of the biggest points of sales for many car manufacturers. If your favorite artist says I'm fucking with this car, then basically what they're saying is you need to go get that car, because everybody heard that album, everybody associated with that artist, identified with that artist, and that particular car is relative to what people identify with that particular artist. There is no shortage of HellCat references in music. From the Migos to Lil Baby to Lil Uzi Vert, there is no short of lyrics that reference the HellCat. The YouTuber Hello Asani, I think I messed up his name, but basically YouTuber Hello Asani did a very interesting video about the death of the HellCat, hip hop's favorite car, and he did an amazing explanation at explaining the lyrics and the references and the pop culture phenomenon behind the HellCat. And aside from clout, the hip hop influence actually allows us to understand why people really want to be a part of this car, because it's not just a car, it's also a movement. And in the car community, nobody really gives a fuck if you have a used HellCat or a new HellCat. The only thing that they care about in the car community is two things. Is it an authentic HellCat and it's not a boosted up SE? And does it sound good? Do it sound good? Because you can slap logos and shit on it, but to be honest, there's nothing more embarrassing than having a fake HellCat, and it's a lot of posers out there. Nobody wants to be caught being a poser. Nobody. And in terms of the HellCat in the car community, that boils back to culture. Culture is a huge part of the car world, and it is pretty much the everyday man's aspiration. I've talked about this, like I said, it's the blue-collar supercar, but it is a representation and a microcosm of a different social issue, which is the attainability factor. And that attainability factor simply says I can have a fast car for cheap. I'm not going to go into cheap cars that are fast, but most cars that are fast are not necessarily expensive, and the Dodge HellCat is essentially the top tier product in terms of horsepower meets fun. In every generation, it's expected that every man understands cars. Now, while all men do not understand cars, it is an idea and a cultural thing to know that if you do get nice cars, you should be able to talk about them. And the HellCat is one of those things that most men love to talk about. In addition to the muscle cars of the Americas, we love to talk about cars, their horsepower, their styling. There also is representation in all of that cultural dissection, because representation is really important in the car community, because everybody cannot afford a BMW, everyone cannot afford a Lamborghini, and so having a fast car that is affordable is a huge part of representation, and the Dodge HellCat represents that. Prior to the globalization of cars before 1973, most American cars were the staple of American society. It was not uncommon for people to have big body Cadillacs, big body Chevys, and Chryslers that were resonant of you had the made it. I think that in American culture, we love our cars, especially by the design of our roadways, and that's a whole different conversation. But our cars are representative and identical to who we believe we are within society. So in terms of representation and cost and pricing, there's a big problem that tends to happen with consumers who tend to gear towards the HellCat, and one of them being they perceive them as investments. Now I'm gonna go ahead and tell y'all right now, no car is an investment. Even as a collector item, it takes years for that car to be understood as a collection. We buy these cars thinking,
oh, this is going to be a long-term investment.
No, the f is not, Billy. People don't give a f about your 76 Camaro, okay? Especially the one that's trashed and you ain't even rebuilt and it's still sitting in the garage. I said what I said. But the idea that a car is an investment is absolutely ludicrous. Most people who buy those cars oftentimes don't even drive them, and they have to be super low mileage, and they lack the utility that most people need from a car, especially if it's a car that people are paying additional dealer markup on, which is going to hit on this point. As an investment, most people tend to see them as investments because they see the overall price. Well, the average price for a Dodge HellCat is upwards of $85,000 to $90,000 before additional dealer markup. Whenever you have clout and hype surrounding a car, most people want to be in that same space. That tells dealers that they need to drive up the price because simple economics says that high demand equals high price. Because of that, they want to make sure that it is not necessarily affordable for everybody, but more importantly, they want to make a dollar holler. The additional dealer markup creates a vacuum effect where most people will end up getting a car significantly overpriced and lose a huge amount of money in depreciation. And even if you were to collect it, let me tell y'all something, you wouldn't even be able to sell that car for what you bought it for. And including for inflation, you really lost a lot of money. And the only person that really won in that scenario was the dealer. There is actually several instances on the internet, particularly on Mopar Insiders, where I found out that this is a bit of an extreme example, but there is a car that is going for $50,000 MSRP, and it's a SRT HellCat wide body. And I'm gonna be honest, the options between the SRT HellCat just was overwhelming. I didn't even want to put my hands on it. There's the HellCat, there's the wide body, there's the jailbreak, there's the red eye, there's the demon, yada yada yada. There were so many configurations and it was just overwhelming. But it was not uncommon for many consumers to say they had paid anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000 over sticker just to say that they had a HellCat. Put that in perspective. People are willing to go into the deep dives of hell just to get a HellCat. I guess that's why they call it that. This is an extreme example, but I really wanted to put this into perspective. And you also have to configure the idea that you also have to pay for the overall cost of the car. For most people that have a HellCat, the parts is usually what makes or breaks them, but there's a lot of people that love to race and mod, and I'll get to that later in the video. But a lot of people like to get these cars and race the out of them, but you know, between brakes, tires, oil changes, and all stuff, that shit is expensive. And this is basically the rendition of a race car, and it's going to cost race car money. The idea that you're going to get a mint condition HellCat is very unlikely, and if you are, you're going to pay a lot of money for it. And these HellCats have pretty huge depreciation curves. So with that, I don't know why anybody would buy that. The average total cost of ownership for a 2022 was upwards of $107,000. Keep in mind, this is before any additional dealer markup, and most of that money was in depreciation. And as I was looking around, I also noticed that there was a huge drop in value in the 2022 to 2023, which essentially lost roughly around $23,000, and the average depreciation was $38,000. Hopefully that did not overwhelm you, but there was a lot to unpack here, and this is all for social clout, mind you. Just want to say they got one. Now, if you just want a HellCat, that's cool. But in addition to it not being an investment, there's also an abundance of parts and aftermarket parts, car swaps, mods that racing people just love to do for the sake of tracking it. And everybody isn't tracking it, but most people who want this car want it for its horsepower, but don't necessarily know how to control it. But there's an abundance of car parts that are on the market, particularly in the eBay sector, Amazon, and a lot of those are cheap Chinese made parts. And so this is what most people aspire for because of what it represents. Because it represents these things, a lot of people don't understand that the parts and the ownership go hand in hand with the social currency that comes along with owning this car. And if I had to put it in layman's terms, this is a very plug and play style car, and there's nothing wrong with that. All cars don't need to be built. This one rides on a modified Mercedes platform, so you really do get a very well-designed, well-engineered platform. And in addition to car parts and costs, we've also got to talk about insurance, because insurance for this particular car is extremely expensive. It real high, bitch. So the insurance for this car varies by state and by zip code. But the insurance factor on this car is incredibly liable, because this car is a hot commodity on the streets. Yes, I said streets with a K. A lot of car thieves absolutely lust at this car because not only what it does, but also what it is capable of doing. I just learned in the history of Dodge and Ford and a lot of them, the history behind a lot of these muscle cars is because a lot of prohibition stuff was going on, and these cars were intentionally designed to outpace a lot of the police cars that were of the 20s upwards of the 60s. The hot rod era and the muscle car era focuses around breaking the law, and so that also ties into the social currency of this car, because it makes you also a badass, and that in its entirety makes it so much more cooler, and that's why a lot of thieves absolutely love this car. Keep in mind that a lot of the electrical and software engineering of this car is basically bullshit, and the Black Car Guru really explained this of the safety and commodity behind this car in a very short video, which I will put in the description below. But he really explained how this car ties into the social currency of the car community. More importantly, how it can be even dangerous to own one. And there's a couple of other car YouTubers that have explained what this car means in terms of ownership and insurance. And there's a lot of insurance companies that will not insure you because of not just your record, but because of the high rates of theft from this car. Just go ahead and pack it up. There is an epidemic of car theft, and car theft has always been a thing, but it's getting really bad now because more and more cars have computers. But this particular car is super simple to steal. Ownership aside, the social currency behind this car really ties into the aspirations of people wanting this car because of what it does for them socially. And that's the big thing. This is not a halo car, but it's a halo car for the car community. And that's what makes it a really strong contender of why people do not understand this car, but they want it. I am absolutely flabbergasted learning about this car. And ultimately, I can say that with horsepower and power and torque and all of those things aside, this car is very hot on the streets, and I understand why. With that being said, leave a comment below and let me know what you think about the Dodge HellCat and why you feel like people want one even though they probably never driven one, never owned one, and never will own one. And with that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later.